Kia ora, haere mai. My name is Kate Deavy, and most of you probably know me. Aotea Poison Free welcome you to this public lecture by our esteemed guest, Sue Gray, and I'll get back to Sue in a moment. So firstly, we want to acknowledge the tangata whenua of these motus, these islands, Ngāti Rehua and Ngāti Wai. And secondly, let us open with a karakia, with prayer. May our minds connect with the sacred within. May our tongues be guided by respect, curiosity, and knowledge. May our hearts be strong in love, and may our actions work towards restoring nature's sacred balance. Amen. I just want to take a minute to briefly outline Aotea Poison Free's journey to this point. And the concerns began when a Barrier Bulletin article on 5 October last year advised of an application for funding to Predator Free New Zealand 2050 Limited by our local board and other supporters, the GBI Environmental Trust and D.O.C, etc. Since then, we've formed our group, the Aotea Poison Free group, gathered signatures for the Stop the Drop of Brodifacoum on Rakitu Island petition. We've presented it to D.O.C. There was significant support for the petition. We've had 19 letters to the editor published in the Barrier Bulletin and other newspapers. Well, I haven't counted those. Had 7 articles published in our local paper. We've represented our group at all biodiversity public meetings, including pro-poison ones. There's been hundreds of emails between us all. Research and information has been collated and distributed. We've had meetings, we've had correspondence with government, and we've had one cartoon. And most symbolically and significantly, there's the Where Do You Draw the Line art exhibition still running and well worth a visit. Now, it is my absolute honour to introduce you to Sue Gray, who holds a holistic life and worldview, has been and is at the forefront of social action for change around corporate, government, environmental, health and well-being impacts, and has the academic credentials to take a stand for people and communities of Aotearoa, holding degrees in both law and science. Clearly a rare and special human being we are blessed to have in our midst, even for a short time. Sue's work therefore provides her with insights and experiences about systemic injustices, the wielding of power that some of us can only guess at, and stories we will hear about tonight, as well as ways forward to empowering small communities. I'll hand it over to Sue.
Kia ora, thank you so much everyone for coming tonight. It's fantastic to see such a great crowd, and I hope I can live up to those lovely welcoming words. I'm just going to get my logistics worked out a wee bit here. Okay, so just by way of background, I'm Sue Gray. I'm a lawyer based in Nelson, but I studied science and environmental management before I studied law. And I got into law because I could see that there were whole aspects of the science and environmental management that you couldn't do without understanding another discipline. I've worked for a whole range of groups in New Zealand. I started out working for the Ministry of Health, Onehunga Borough Council. As a lawyer, I've worked for a big firm. I've been a partner in a niche firm. I now work for myself, and I love working for communities, helping communities, but also I help niche businesses on projects. I help a whole range of different groups, and I've worked with a lot of iwi on different issues as well. So one of the things I like to bring to things is the different perspectives, because there's often not just one answer or one way of doing things, and there's often, if you listen to different people and talk to different people, you can learn so much. And sometimes you can put together a solution that works for everybody in a situation that didn't ever seem like that was going to be possible. So that's always my objective, to find a sustainable solution that works for communities with all the different pieces of the jigsaw puzzle for any issue that there is. And to find a solution that people can be proud of and that works for the future and not just for the short term. Right. So over the last ever since I started studying law and science, I wanted to get into environmental issues and public rights. So in the last few years, it's really finally all sort of started to come together, and I've done a lot of work on aerial poisons. I'm currently the lawyer for the Brook Valley in Nelson, which is my local community. We've been in the High Court and we're in the Court of Appeal at the end of May, challenging the resource management exemption regulations which Nick Smith passed last year, the former Minister for Conservation and latterly the Minister for the Environment. The issue of concern with those regulations is that they exempt aerial poison drops, 1080 and Brodifacoum and rotenone, from all the usual protection of the Resource Management Act. So the issue in Nelson, which was really interesting, was it went through a resource consent process. The independent commissioner imposed 47 conditions of consent that were designed to avoid, remedy or mitigate effects. But once the regulations were passed, what I call the poisoners surrendered their resource consent so they could then drop the poison without any of those conditions. And so the community were pretty unhappy about that. I've also been advising the Patararu family. I call them the not botulism family because they never had botulism, but it was widely reported in the media that they had. And there's been a whole team of us from around New Zealand with different skills, doctors, vets, biochemists, just people that are prepared to spend hours and hours reading wads of documents, people that have worked for hospitals, and a whole range of people going through all that to try and understand for that family what actually made them sick. And the amazing thing was when we finally got the hospital files, the very first most likely suspected cause listed on those files on day one after they had assessed all their symptoms was 1080 poisoning from the wild boar that they'd eaten. But that was listed at 6 o'clock in the evening. By 11 o'clock that night, that had gone off the agenda mysteriously without any explanation at all, and it started to be called botulism or suspected botulism poisoning. They were in hospital for 4 to 6 weeks, the three of them. During that time, a number of doctors said, this isn't botulism, and kept putting 1080 back on the agenda, and then it would go off again, it would disappear. It took 18 days before they tested any samples for 1080, and that was only after some OIA requests were made to the hospital asking for, well, where are the 1080 results? And finally they tested, but the problem was then the sample was so old, and the samples are unstable because they can suffer from bacterial breakdown. They didn't meet the criteria for reliable sampling, and they came back negative, which wasn't at all surprising. It turned out that MPI also had a whole lot of samples from the actual pork curry that was eaten and from the wild boar, but they chose not to test any of those for 1080. They had them sitting in their freezer, and as far as I know, they're still in the freezer, never been tested. So they didn't want to find 1080. What happened arising from that was another group of really dedicated people put together a register of non-intended poisoning consequences from aerial poison, so basically 1080 and Brodifacoum, and I'll talk more about it later, but that register records at least 13 incidents of human poisoning from 1080 and Brodifacoum, some of them resulting in death, and many of them resulting in really serious ill health consequences, and hundreds of cases of dead stock and dead dogs. We know that there are dead dogs grossly underreported from previous studies. All sorts of consequences, and also dead kea and native birds, which are the very species that are supposed to be protected. We've been, Kathy White, who's the regional councillor in Waikato, and myself went to Wellington to try and personally deliver the register to the government. The government didn't want to meet us. We kind of expected that would happen, but it said it all really, because there'd been a huge amount of work gone into it by people. We'd actually got only cases that had been covered by affidavit evidence or documented evidence. There were no just sort of hearsay, anecdotal cases. These were all serious cases supported by hospital documentation, none of which, not a single one of which, had got onto the official government documentation being reported as poisoning. So what we have is a major, major underreporting of poisoning. And I've followed it through just recently in Nelson with the Brodifacoum poisoning, because unfortunately we couldn't stop that poisoning case. We tried, we couldn't stop it. But the community were very, very interested in what happened and followed at every stage. On the day of the poisoning, we had, well, the night before as well, we had police everywhere trying to block the public from getting anywhere near, because some of us might have been terrorists or something. Actually, we were mostly sort of middle-aged mothers and grandmothers, but you know, it makes a much better story that we might do something terrible, and guys as well. So what happened, by coincidence, I decided to drive up to the motor camp next to where the poison drop zone was, and at the same time Jim Hilton, who some of you may know, who's been working on 1080 for years, was there with his video camera, and one of the city councillors went up to have a look too. Just as we got there and we were talking to one of the residents who happened to have asbestosis and was living in a caravan at the motor camp, and it's an area where people who can't afford homes set up sort of temporary accommodation. They often do have different health conditions. Just as we were there, a helicopter flew right past, about 20 metres away, dropping aerial poison along the boundary of the drop zone, which was also the boundary of the Brook motor camp. I got a terrible taste in my mouth and started coughing, so I jumped in my car, but Jim bravely stood out there and continued videoing. For the rest of the day, I sort of felt like I'd been sunburnt, or my skin was burning. I had this really irritated throat, and that night it turned into a cough, and I had an awful cough, and I just felt exhausted for the next couple of weeks. Turned out when I met Jim and the councillor Tim Skinner a couple of weeks later, that they had had almost identical symptoms. Now, I reported mine to the National Poison Centre, who gave me some completely hopeless advice. I reported mine to the Medical Office of Health, the Nelson City Council and everybody else. Nobody was remotely interested. The others did the same. A couple of weeks later, I found out two other residents who lived, they were some of the closest houses to the helicopter loading zone for that site. One lady had cystic fibrosis, and so she does have sensitive health anyway at the best of times, but her husband had been incredibly healthy. She'd been really ill since the first poison drop, but they'd decided to go away on holiday and have a bit of a break. While they were away, she still continued to be ill and spent a lot of time in bed. Her husband had a small cut on his arm. When he woke up in the morning, there was blood everywhere on the bed. Now, Brodifacoum is an anticoagulant, and they went to the doctor. The only possible cause of his bleeding that they could identify was Brodifacoum poisoning, just from the air around their home, going for a few walks around the drop and having a look. Again, they and their doctors notified that to the Medical Office of Health in Nelson, never got on the register. And they're still ringing up every week and saying, when are you going to investigate this? So when you hear that there's no poisoning in New Zealand, it's not true. What's true is that the Ministry of Health are not recording any cases of poisoning or suspected poisoning in New Zealand. And I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this, because, oh sorry, I'll just go, oh, doesn't matter, I'll go back. Just because what happens is there's a big difference between no evidence and people not reading the evidence. And there's also a big difference between depending on the assumptions that we make, the starting point. So I've just skipped over it. But the other work I've been doing a lot of is medicinal cannabis law reform work to try and get much better access for people who want to use cannabis for medicinal purposes. We've got this bizarre situation in New Zealand where cannabis and hemp has been used for communities for 4,000 years, all around the world. Every ancient civilization used it for health purposes. It's been used legally for 99% of its history. But under the law, the way it's interpreted at the moment, we assume that it's dangerous because there's not enough evidence to justify its use, because the government won't accept it's safe. On the other hand, poison, now just think, it's called poison for a reason. It's prohibited in most countries. It comes with a label, do not inhale, do not do this, do not do that, avoid contact with water, everything else, keep your pets away, and its purpose is to kill things. We assume that poison is safe until there's enough evidence to prove it's dangerous. So this is some of the problems we're working with the so-called scientific method. I've got a background in science, but I'm ashamed of the consequences and outcome the scientific method is giving us as a result of the way it's being applied. There's nothing wrong with science, but the way it's being applied is bamboozling the public to give a degree of reassurance that actually we shouldn't be reassured. Go back to our gut instinct about it. Read the labels yourself. Read the research yourself. Do not trust what you are told, because it may well not be true, unfortunately. So today I want to talk about making better decisions for our future, the risks associated with aerial poisons, the duties of government, what other communities are doing, and what you can do. Because when it comes down to it, we're all going to die waiting for our government to do something. But there are a lot of things that we as individuals and as communities can do to safeguard our own health and our own environment. When I get to the end, we'll have some question time. If we've got time, I'm happy to talk about the other issues that I'm working on if anyone's interested. But what I'll do today is focus on the poisons issue, because there's so much information on that. I'm going to struggle to get through it all anyway. So we'll just stick with that for now. But if there is time, we'll talk about the rest. Yeah. Okay. So the good thing about the poisoning issue is that we actually all agree on the most important thing. I believe we all agree. We all agree that it's important to protect our native birds. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. The issue is how best to do it, and that's where there are different views and different evidence. And we want to do it without causing harm to the ecosystems in our environment. And the question that I ask you is poison okay at any price? Because DOC evidence will tell you that we have to poison to save our birds. My view from the research I've done is everything comes at a cost. Poison comes at a lot of cost, and it comes with a lot of uncertainties. If there are better ways of achieving the outcome that we want to achieve, which is saving the birds, at the very least, we need to look at those alternatives, and we need to make informed decisions, and we need to make decisions that the community is happy with and buys into, because making New Zealand predator-free is a massive task, and whatever resources DOC has, it is not going to achieve it without the community being on side. And it's such an important thing to find solutions that everybody can work with and buy into, because if you're going to turn half your community, or whatever percent it is, against a project before it starts, it's on a hiding to nowhere. So, and also everyone's got to live together and work together and live in this community. It's a place where you all live. It's a place where you all value, or you wouldn't live here. If you get a solution that maybe saves some birds at least and not other birds, or even if it saves all birds, if it's poisoning your water supply or if it's poisoning your food supply, is it worth it? So we've got to make sure we're asking the right questions. The question is, yes, how do we save the birds? But the questions have got to be other questions as well, or we're going to end up with something that's not fit for purpose, and that's actually ruining the very reason that we're all here, loving the place that we're in. There are lots of national concerns about aerial poisons, and you probably know most of these, and everyone's got their own particular concerns on top of this. There are public health concerns, environmental health concerns, and the cumulative effect. So a lot of the research looks at sort of one-off short term, but there's nobody, as far as I'm aware, looking at the sort of longer term effects. And that's the thing that I'm really concerned about, not just how many people die or animals die, but what is it doing to the biological systems, to the ecosystems, to the food chain in the medium and long term? And some of those effects don't show up straight away, but they keep adding up. And when you get to a critical point, and then it's too late to do anything. So what we've got to do is somehow find ways of making decisions that factor in all of those effects. The animal welfare is a big concern for a lot of people too. American EPA did a study on Brodifacoum and a whole range of other rodenticides, and they ranked Brodifacoum as the worst of all of the rodenticides they looked at in terms of animal welfare, the cruelty to the animals that were dying because it's such a slow death, and a whole range of other environmental factors because of the the cumulative effect of it in the environment. So if we must use poison, and I don't believe we do, but if it's decided that we do, at the very least, we need to choose our poisons very carefully and make sure that they're the most humane and the least harmful. The bycatch of native birds and other wildlife is a huge issue, and I understand particularly here with the weka. And the weka is a difficult species for D.O.C because on the one hand it's a native species, but on the other hand it's a predator that is known to eat other native species. And that's part of the natural ecosystem, but it doesn't fit neatly into the sort of design of how some people want things to be. Contamination of the food chain, another major issue of concern, particularly now that MPI, the Ministry of Primary Industries, acknowledges that poisons do build up in trout. They've done more studies. I'm not sure what they've done on Brodifacoum, but on 1080, they've done studies. They now acknowledge one bait of 1080 eaten by a trout makes that trout unsafe to eat for at least 6 days. Now they're guessing the 6 days because they did a previous study to try and look at how long it stayed in trout. They thought that trout would be like warm-blooded animals and it would go quickly through their body, but what they learnt is that trout are not like warm-blooded animals because they're not warm-blooded animals, they're cold-blooded, and it stays a long time in their body. The study ran out after 5 days, and by then the MPI or the Cawthron scientists doing the work for them had run out of trout. So they couldn't work out how much longer it would take for trout to remove 1080 from their body. All they could say it was sort of up and down over the day 2, 3, 4, 5, and who knows where it went after that. It may be that trout have still got 1080 in their body after a week, it may be after 2 weeks, it may be after a month. And of course the other problem is that the MPI now do have a warning on their website saying do not eat trout within a week of an aerial poison drop in that zone. But the problem is, of course, the trout don't read the signs and they don't necessarily stay in the zone. We now know we have the same problem with wild pork and the problem with the Pataru family eating wild pork. In their case, it was wild pork that a hunter caught and gave to them. We think he gave to them, he may have sold it to them illegally, but either way they ended up eating only a small part of the wild pork, but they cooked it thoroughly. Every other food, well, there was no other food it could have been. We've been through all the other foods and that was the only meal that they all ate. All three that ate it got sick within about 5 or 6 hours or less. They started feeling nauseous with less time. They all got sick. The people that didn't eat it didn't get sick. We know from that wild pork can make people sick, and the most likely cause of that was 1080 poisoning. Now, the poisons register that we did, I spoke to some other people who had eaten large amounts of wild pork, who were hunters, and they had also had very similar symptoms. One of them was in the Navy, super fit guy, used to go hunting every weekend, all of a sudden lost all his energy, went to the doctor, didn't know what was wrong with him, woke up in the morning, there was an ambulance outside his house because the doctor had just got the blood results back from the hospital and sent the ambulance there, rang him, said the minute you're out of bed, you get in that ambulance and you get into hospital because you've got something seriously wrong with you. So again, it never got followed through and identified as 1080 poisoning. It never got onto any public register, but the only possible cause of those symptoms that matched up with 1080. And to make it even clearer, his best mate used to go hunting with him roughly half the time, eating the same type of foods in the Puriora State Forest, where they'd catch some trout and eat some pork. He also had a similar symptoms, but not as severe. And they ended up with the same kind of chronic fatigue symptoms that the Pataru family have ended up with mitochondrial damage, and we don't know how long the effects will be on them. They may be permanent, and we don't know what the fertility effects will be on them. But there's a lot of people with similar type of effects that have not got caught up through the public health system or not been recorded as having those effects. Another concern that a lot of people have with aerial poisons is the unexplained deaths of marine wildlife after poisoning drops in the islands. And it's been an issue, I know, in Auckland and some of the Auckland beaches where some of the other Auckland islands have had poison drops, and a week or so later they found large numbers of dead fish and other animals on the beaches. As far as I know, it's never been officially confirmed as being related to Brodifacoum poisoning. but there's been a lot of speculation about that and nobody's come up with any other causes. So, and the coincidence, they did aerial Brodifacoum drops in Hawaii and Leilua. Miraculously, about a week or two later, a whole lot of dead animals washed up there as well. So again, they say, oh, it's just a coincidence, and hey, it's possible it's just a coincidence, but we can't be sure that it is safe. And if we keep ignoring it and we keep failing to test these animals, we're never going to know. But in the meantime, do we assume it's safe or do we assume it's dangerous? Well, I say let's just err on the side of caution, because once you start poisoning things, there's no going back. And the animals that don't die, it's still building up in the food chain. So the other animals, it's building up as one animal eats another. The Brodifacoum's not going away. It's bioaccumulative. Another major concern for communities, and especially with the resource management exemption regulations, is the lack of consultation of communities, because communities are fundamental to conservation. We can't get conservation without communities being on board for it. What's the point? If we're poisoning the environment, is it really conservation anyway? And if the community is not happy and the community doesn't give informed consent, then it's not consultation and it's not achieving anything. So you can't give informed consent if you don't know what the choices are, what the risks are, what the consequences might be. And that's another one of the major problems. We don't have that conversation. We're not having the right conversations. We're not having consultation. If anyone's from D.O.C here, I'm really happy to talk to them about what's been happening on this so far, and I understand directives come from Wellington and elsewhere, it's not necessarily a local thing. But consultation means talking with an open mind, talking to affected people before you've made a decision about what you want to do, to actually listen to people and listen to people's views and listen to people's values and identify all the choices and factor in all the concerns of the community, and only then after there's been that conversation and consideration, then coming up with a proposal of what's going to be done. If it's done the other way around and the decision's already been made and then it's just a token gesture of saying, oh, we're telling you that we're doing this and we're doing it on that date, that's not consultation. And the court's very clear about that. And with the resource management exemption regs, there's not even often any attempt at consultation at all, because that whole process has been avoided. And the other concern is this information gaps thing. We're never going to know all the information. We're never going to know all the risks. But at some point, there's enough information to make an informed guess, and it is only a guess, that there's likely to be harm. And one of the problems we've had with science, it's not just with poison, it's with vaccines, it's with fluoride, there's a whole range, glyphosate, tobacco, methyl bromide, asbestos. There are red flags that something may be a health or environmental problem. And there are red flags a long, long, long time before the authorities recognise and accept those red flags. In the case of tobacco, there was over 100 years before the first warnings came out that tobacco may cause lung cancer, and officials recognising that tobacco is not safe and it should be discouraged. Asbestos. How many people got irreversible asbestosis and died between the time when they knew that asbestos was dangerous and the time when it actually became recognised and prohibited? We're now unfortunately going through the same sort of cycle. It's nothing new, because we actually had the same thing with the Romans with their lead pipes. They killed their own community, their own incredibly advanced community, by this magnificent new plumbing system that killed them and died off their community. So it's nothing new. What's happening in some places around the world, though, is they're saying, hey, we've got a problem here. This scientific method that we're using is not giving us the right outcomes. Let's look at other ways so that we get an earlier warning device before it's too late, before all the harm is done. So there's an alternative methodology that I call the jigsaw puzzle effect, which is, instead of getting one strand of evidence and following it right through to the end, and then every time there's lack of evidence of this or lack of evidence of that, you chuck it out. That's what we've been doing. It doesn't work. It doesn't ask all the questions. The jigsaw puzzle type approach is, look, let's get all the pieces we do know. Something's a poison. Okay, well, that's a pretty good warning that it might be harmful for at least some species, or it wouldn't be a poison. You know, look, all those animals die with all these effects. Gosh, these other people have got similar effects. Maybe it's related. Let's put in all those pieces as we find them. And just as with a jigsaw puzzle, you can actually get a pretty clear picture of where things are heading before you have all the pieces. And once we get to a certain stage that it's looking like we might have a problem, let's talk about it, and let's talk about what solutions there are and what alternatives there are, so we can err on the side of caution and start to protect ourselves, rather than blindly continuing on saying science is telling us there's no problem, and going down the same old path that we've been going down with all these other poisons over the years. So who bears the risk is fundamental, and that's the point I made with the hemp. We somehow assume that that's dangerous, even though it's been legal for 99% of history and there's no evidence of any harm, whereas with poisons we somehow assume that they're safe, even though it's blatantly obvious there's a whole range of harm. The other issue with poisons, and it's not just with poisons, if somebody is promoting something, they tend to overstate the benefits and they tend to understate the harm. It's human nature, but it happens with D.O.C, with the way they put forward information about poisons. They choose the benefits that suit them, and they choose not to tell us the things that don't quite match the desired picture. So we hear about the odd species as doing particularly well, but they don't tell us so much about the Kia, where 12.5% are dying each 1080 drop, and when you've got for the Kia that are exposed in that area, and that's from their monitored ones, they don't tell us that the nesting mothers are dying, and so although they might have had a nesting success, that Kia is never going to nest again because it died. So we've got to be really careful about what data we're being given and what we're looking at, because it's just like advertising for sugar and cigarettes and all the other things that get advertised. The people that want something to happen will tell you the best part of their story, and it's often what they don't say that's the important part. So part of this is awareness and talking to each other and learning, so that we are asking better questions and making sure that we are saying, hang on, but you haven't said anything about this. What's going to happen? What do we know about this? Where are the risks? Because decisions that use unreliable assumptions do not give sustainable management. They don't achieve sustainable management. They're an illusion. They're not a solution. So we might know what we think we know. Sometimes we're right. Sometimes we're not even right about what we think we know. If we're pretty smart, we have a good think about what we don't know, and we're honest about that, and we're aware of the gaps. There's a really big problem about the things that we don't even know that we don't know. We're not even asking the questions at all. And again, if you're starting to put things into the environment and you don't even know that they might be a problem, you're not even alert to the risks, you're not alert to what alternatives and what precautions you can take. And the risk is for the public and the environment of all of these things. Every time we get it wrong, it's another little risk on top of all the other risks. And so I've talked about that, just other examples that we assume are safe. Again, Roundup, you know, we were told that you could drink a glass. When I trained as a health inspector, we were told by the Ministry of Health's Chief Occupational Health Advisor that you could drink a glass of Roundup, it wouldn't do you any harm at all. And we were told that all these communities that think there might be a problem don't understand science and they don't know what they're talking about. That's what we were told. That's why I know how government departments think, because I was taught like that too. That's what we're taught. And it's really unfortunate, but that's what's happened. But just always keep that point in mind when you're thinking about it. What's our starting assumption? Because that makes all the difference to who bears the risk in the meantime if we get it wrong. Now, just to tell you a bit more about the Brook Valley, I think it's useful because it's quite a similar situation. There are differences, but it's quite similar. The Brook Valley, it was a public reserve for over 100 years. It was the main water supply for Nelson water catchment until, I think, about 15 years ago. It's still scheduled as a water reserve, 711 hectares. They said it was far too difficult to trap for whatever reason, far too steep. Turns out there are tracks all through it anyway. It's predator fenced, or they say it's predator fenced. In actual fact, it's quite a unstable zone, and every time it rains, the predator fencing tends to slip, and there's holes where predators can get through. There's also problems because in the ideal design, you'd have your fences going up the ridges and along the tops of the hills, but because there's a historic railway track going along the side of the hill, they've had to keep the fence below that. So when it's heavy rain, there's a lot of water coming down, heading into the fence and building up. So what they have to do is, what they have been doing until they poisoned it, was opening the grates at the bottom and letting everything just rush through, because if they didn't open the grates, they'd end up with a whole stash of rocks and rubble and twigs and everything else backing up against their fence on the inside, and equally on the downstream side, the same sort of thing, because there was even more water running through by there. It's adjacent to the Brook Motor Camp, and the Brook Stream, which is the only Class A water in Nelson City, starts in the Brook Valley at the area, passes through a residential suburb, Brook Valley, past several schools and into the marina. They went through this limited notification consent process, 47 conditions to avoid, remedy or mitigate the effects. But because of the resource management exemption regulations and the surrender of that consent, there was none of those conditions applied. Now, it's quite interesting because those regulations allow 1080 anywhere in New Zealand. They allow Brodifacoum anywhere on the North and South Island in a fenced sanctuary, but on any other island, anywhere on those islands. So you're on one of those other islands. So at the moment we're talking about Rakitu, but under the regulations, if they stand and continue to stand after the next round of the legal challenge, potentially Brodifacoum can be dropped anywhere on Great Barrier Island without any consultation process or any consent. And it's really important to know that, because I believe the regulations are completely unconstitutional and completely ignore. Maybe they're valid for uninhabited islands, but they're certainly not valid for Great Barrier Island, Waiheke Island, Stewart Island and all the other inhabited islands around New Zealand, completely disregarding the rights of everybody. And the exemption, though, is only in relation to Section 15, which is a section which allows for the discharge, so basically the release of contaminants. The Minister for the Environment, Nick Smith, who's our local MP in Nelson, which he's not terribly popular in Nelson at the moment, he made a number of assumptions for those regulations, that the effects are the same wherever the poison's used. Well, I think anyone can say that the effects are quite different depending on where the poison is used. That community values are the same throughout New Zealand, well, I think we can question that one too. The risks from aerial poisons are negligible, and compliance and enforcement's not a problem at all, because we've got all these great other legislation that covers all these things. Well, what we've found in the Brook Valley is, yes, there is a lot of other government organisations that are supposed to enforce these regulations, but not a single one of them do enforce their regulations. Massive, massive difference between what the law says and what actually happens. MPI are supposed to enforce the new code that became rapidly passed, because we found out during the High Court case that the old code for Brodifacoum had expired about 10 years before. Nick Smith missed that when he passed his regulations. So they brought in the Operating Plan 63, which assumes that the MPI, Ministry of Primary Industries, will enforce the code. But of course, they're actually only interested in food. That's their mandate. They aren't interested in people. They're not interested in aerial dust problems. They're not interested in contamination of the environment or killing native species, because that's not their mandate. There's major, major problems with all four of those assumptions. And we've probably covered some of this, but the criticism of those regulations that affected communities are excluded from decision making. People that have lived there their whole lives, next door to an area that's to be poisoned, under the regulations have no say. And of course other interested people have no say either. And it again assumes all the effects are the same. It assumes that there are no site-specific considerations, whereas of course there are, depending on the location and the soil, the vegetation, the species present, all sorts of things. There's no provision for any conditions to be imposed to minimise effects. So under the old resource consent process, it wasn't perfect, but at least they could impose conditions to protect against special problems. And under the old resource consent processes, the council can put in that they'll monitor, but they can recover their costs for monitoring. Under the exemption regulations, there's no provision for the council to recover for all their costs. So guess what? They don't do it. So in the High Court, we took two arguments. One is a completely different section from the regulations that we came across, section 13, 1D. No person shall deposit a substance on the bed of any river without permission from a plan or resource consent. I thought that that section was clear-cut winner. Okay, the Brook Valley is a water catchment. There are water courses all through it. The definition of water course includes permanent or intermittent streams. Whether you deposit it by hand off the back of a truck or from a helicopter, if you're putting it where you want it to go, it's surely a deposit. And you would have thought that a toxic poison bait is a substance. Unfortunately, what the judge said is when Parliament wrote that, where they said substance, they actually meant safe substance. They didn't mean hazardous substance. Now, I still struggle. I can't explain it. So you can't put a safe substance on the bed of a river, but you can put a hazardous substance on the back of the river, according to the High Court judge. We're in the Court of Appeal on the 30th of May, so hopefully we will get a different decision. And this section will be relevant for you guys too, because there's water courses on Rakitu, and the current practice is to aerially drop over the entire treatment area, including water. There's also a section 12 in the Resource Management Act, I think it's 12.1d, which is very similar about depositing in a coastal marine area on the foreshore or seabed. So if D.O.C rely on exemption regulations for section 15 for the actual discharge part, potentially they still have a serious problem with section 12 and 13 where the baits land. Because if they land in the bed of a river or if they land in the foreshore or seabed, which seems like it's inevitable in Rakitu, because if you put something on the side of a rolling hill, it's going to roll down, I would have thought, that potentially is a breach of these sections of the Act. Our other argument was that the regulations themselves were unlawful and unconstitutional, unreasonable, because community consultation and ascertaining community values is fundamental to the whole purpose of the Resource Management Act. That is what it's for, that each community can say what's important to them and what their values are. And if you exclude that and you assume that everybody in New Zealand's got the same values and that we all think that protecting native birds and using poison is the most important thing for sustainable management in New Zealand, and it trumps everything else. It trumps clean water, it trumps ecosystems, it trumps environments, it trumps healthy people and everything else. If we all think that, well, Nick might have been right, but I don't believe that assumption can be made, so we're challenging that. We're challenging that he failed to consider mandatory consideration. So under the Resource Management Act, there's a whole hierarchy of other things that must be considered. You can't just choose one horse and say, all we're backing is protecting native birds. You have to look at all the other protections, the iwi values, all the other long-term sustainable values, clean water and everything else. He made, of course, errors in fact and law, and we're arguing the Magna Carta, which is kind of a bit of fun because it's quite nice to refer back to the Magna Carta from the 1200s, but that is where New Zealand law comes from, and we've got a real problem in New Zealand with a lack of sort of firm constitutional law. So I believe it's quite important to go back and look at where our law came from, and all those fundamental rights, the rights of property right, of freedom, from false arrest, and of your customs, are protected way back from the 1200s, and those laws still stand in New Zealand. So that's a bit of an effort to get a bit of recognition of the background and say, look, this is not some new fad that people want to be consulted with. This is actually fundamental. And so that's, yeah, it protects freehold liberties and free customs. The custom to take your own food, to catch your own food, really well-established custom. If it's poisoned and you can't take it anymore, that's undermining our fundamental rights, I believe. We'll see what the court says. And these are the type of values that are protected in Part 2 of the Resource Management Act, clean water amenity values, which are the values to communities that people hold dear, to hunt and fish and enjoy, relax, and the intrinsic values, so the natural values for other ecosystems. They're all protected, cultural and spiritual values. While I'm talking about cultural and spiritual values, I'll tell you a story that's a little bit off point, but it's not really, because it's about a case I did in Golden Bay, which is a similar kind of community to the Great Barrier community. A lot of people quite aware of health and those kind of considerations. People don't want to live in big cities. There's a yoga retreat on top of the hill in Golden Bay. It's a long distance, I think 8 kilometres up a zigzag gravel road from Takaka, which in itself is a long way from anywhere. Vodafone decided they wanted to put a cell tower about 200 metres from this community on the top of Takaka Hill. The community was smart, and they spoke to each other, and they spoke to me, and as always I say, well, look, you need to make people aware, make a big fuss, because if you don't make a big fuss, it will happen before you know it. So they managed to get quite a few hundred submissions opposing the cell tower. So the council said, oh gosh, yeah, okay, under the Resource Management Act, we've got to look at cultural and spiritual values. We need a report. Vodafone could not find anyone that would give them a report that said there was no impact on the cultural and spiritual values of that unique community. So fantastic, stalled the process. But then Vodafone decided that they really did want their cell tower, and this whole resource consent process was rather annoying. So if they made their tower a couple of metres shorter and knocked a few extra bits off it, it would fit within the permitted use activities of the plan. What Vodafone didn't understand was the community were actually quite intelligent, and they weren't going to just be fobbed off that easily. And they went away and did some research, found out that, yes, the tower itself might comply, but the tower couldn't operate without all these satellite dishes and things. And when you added all those on, it no longer would fit the existing or permitted uses of the plan. So by then the council had been bamboozled by Vodafone, and they had granted a compliance certificate to say it could all go ahead without any public hearing. We went to the Environment Court and put in an application for a declaration saying, well, actually they can't do it without all these attachments, and then it won't be allowed. Miraculously, Vodafone then decided that this cell tower wasn't a priority for them, and they didn't really want to go through a resource consent process and have to defend not telling the council about the real state of the Vodafone tower that they wanted to put in, and the whole thing went away. So, you know, small community standing up for its own values can win and can stop something happening that it doesn't want. Just has to be smart, organised, and be prepared to make a stand and speak out and be heard. So there's hope. Look, however frustrating the system can be, there's always hope, and you've got to remember that. So with the Brook case, the High Court judge didn't like us. He decided that substance meant substance that's safe and not toxic substance, and he didn't like our arguments about Nick Smith not applying the law properly and considering communities. But we've got an appeal on the 30th of May, so we'll see how we go on that one. If we win that one, it will have implications here. So certainly if we win on section, thank you, if we win on sections 13, it will definitely have implications here. So during the High Court case, we established that the old Food Safety Australia New Zealand Code for pest off had expired. Nobody had noticed, and the government, despite them signing off these regulations and everything else and assuring everybody that there were plenty of protections in place, the MPI and DOC urgently wrote a whole new Operating Plan 63 for Brodifacoum to replace the expired code. We thought fantastic because that required consultation with affected persons. It had a lovely definition of affected persons, which included any landowners, but also any other persons that would be affected in any way. Fantastic. Then the what we call the poisoners in the Brook Valley went back to MPI and said, oh, but this isn't fair because we really want to poison and we thought we were going to be allowed to. So MPI wrote an exemption into it saying, oh, but if you already wanted to poison this year, you don't have to comply with the new code. So they went ahead and did it. You guys have got a potential problem because Operating Plan 63 is much better than the old provision. But DOC is exempt from it. Now, don't ask me why DOC is exempt, and DOC doesn't have to consult when everybody else who wants to poison does. I think it's because it's one government department and another government department, and there's an assumption at law that a government is representing the public interest, and it will do what's right for the people, and it will consult, and so it doesn't even need to be written down anywhere. Now, some of that wisdom has been lost in recent years and with recent governments. So this is a bit of a test for DOC as to whether DOC will apply the same standards to its conduct on the island as any other person would have to follow. And if there's anyone from DOC here who's able to answer any sort of comment about where all this is heading, it would be awesome. As I understand it, with Great Barrier and Rakitu, public land managed by DOC, so DOC must comply with its obligations. And DOC has always been very good at recognising it does have obligations to consult and work with communities, and with its consistent inadequacies in its budget, it needs communities to help it to achieve its work. So it says the right thing. This case is a test of whether it actually walks the talk. Because it's one thing for DOC to say nice things and we consult and we do all these things. But if it doesn't actually do those things, that's actually dishonest. And so it's really important from the community's perspective that you make DOC do what it says it's going to do, and that it does consult with the community, and consult, as we've said, isn't just tell the community what it's going to do, but it listens to what the community wants and gets an informed view from the community when the community is aware of all the options and before a final decision is made. And all alternatives must be on the table. The alternative might be leave it as it is because it's been cruising along as it is for a while, and by all accounts, I just read the DOC website about Rakitu Island. It says it's thriving with wildlife and it's wonderful. If that's true, then maybe leave it as it is. I don't know. If it's not true, well, they need to correct their information on their website and look at pest management alternatives, but there are lots of alternatives. And in the old days, aerial poisoning was the last alternative when none of the others were available. It's become the sort of cheap, easy, fashionable alternative in recent years, but it doesn't mean it's the best alternative. And in some cases, it's clearly not a good alternative. If it's going to fall in the water and questions of whether it's going to work anyway, there's got to be more information to actually say, is it even going to work and what alternatives can work better? And for example, let's say we try trapping, and trapping's been successful in Northland, it's been successful in the Aoteas, it's been successful with the good nature traps, the reusable ones. In Fiordland, they've had some fabulous results, 100% success rate in removing rodents in relatively small areas, but still 100% success rate. Rakitu's a relatively small area. Why not try that? Try the option of least harm first. If it doesn't work, you can still go back and try options that might have more harm. But don't try the option that's going to have some irreversible effects first and then say, oh, gee, why did we do that? We didn't expect that to happen. You know, it's just a case of working carefully through the options. And I've got some questions for DOC, and you guys may have asked them already. And if you haven't, and DOC may or may not have answered them, I don't know. But at what stage of the planning process is DOC at with Rakitu? Because do we know, as I understand it, they're still consulting. They haven't consulted yet really with the community, so they clearly can't have made a final decision. They've had a lot of information about what people want. I don't believe there's been any feedback on that. So what are they going to go through more consultation? Are they still looking at alternatives? Are they considering trapping? What are they doing? If these questions haven't been asked, I suggest somebody ask them. I'm happy to share the slides if anyone wants them. Will D.O.C comply with Operating Plan 63 for Brodifacoum poisoning, even though D.O.C isn't formally required to comply? But that's a best practice plan put out by MPI. Surely D.O.C will agree to comply with it because it's best practice. Why wouldn't they? Because D.O.C likes best practices. If not, why not? Who has D.O.C consulted with already and how far have they got with that process? Who have they recognised as affected persons? Operating Plan 63 defines affected persons, and it defines it quite widely as anybody that may be affected. So I would imagine that anyone here that's taken enough trouble to be here is likely to be an affected person, and certainly as a community you are. If poison is going to be used, where's the helicopter going to be loaded? Does anyone know that? Is it going to be loaded on Great Barrier? Is it going to be loaded out at sea? Or is it going to be loaded on Rakitu Island? Has anyone got the answer? Can you share with us what? Okay. Okay. Is it that you know where it's going to be loaded, but you can't tell us? Okay. Okay. On the mainland here and on Great Barrier. Okay. Okay, so there are issues depending where, because there's been some cases where D.O.C have loaded on barges in the Marlborough Sounds. It's been a disaster because the flying backwards and forwards in the dust and the washdown afterwards has meant a real risk for the marine environment. If it's loaded over here, what happened in Nelson and the Brook Valley, the whole area where they loaded was out of the sanctuary, but next to the sanctuary on public reserve land. It had to be fenced off for months because of the dust and the pollution from that. And there was also an oil spill from the helicopter. I think there were probably a couple of oil spills or fuel spills as well that added to the problems. So potentially you end up with a contaminated site, depending, may or may not, but it's a risk and it needs to be looked into. We would really raise with the council a resource consent is required for that loading site generally because, well, maybe not here because of the exemption regs, and this already is an island, but potentially a resource consent is required to make sure it should be a bunded site so that if there is any spill, it's all contained, it's not running off into adjacent wetlands and that type of thing. You've got to keep the dust down. The dust can be a real problem. Even when they put some water or whatever on the dust, it still spreads. Then they put the water on, but as it flies, it sort of dries, and you get dust coming out as it's flying across. So if it's loading on the mainland, potentially you're going to get dust spreading over the coastal area between here and the island. So someone needs to be looking at all of those issues. Questions about what birds actually are on Rakitu, what data D.O.C has got about what they're actually trying to protect. And that sounds pretty obvious, but most of the cases I've been involved in, D.O.C actually hasn't done those pre-poisoning surveys, which is a huge problem because you can't then go back and say, has it been successful or not? Because you actually don't know what there was before you started, and you've got nothing to compare it with afterwards. Bad science. What predators are you trying to kill? And that's really, really important too, because you need to know what you're trying to kill and how many of them there are, because you need to know how much poison to put and where to put it, because they may not even all be on the same part of the island. They may be concentrated in areas, they may be evenly spread. You need the data before you start. One of the problems we had identified by an expert in pest control who did an affidavit for the Brook community is that rodents are like squirrels. They collect the baits and they hoard them for later. So if they've got enough other food, they'll just go and find all the baits and bring them back to their burrow. They may not eat them for a day, a month, 6 months. They may die before they eat them all. And you end up with stashes of poison baits spread around in different locations and holes in the ground and that kind of thing, in caves perhaps over there. And so that wasn't factored in at all in the Brodifacoum drop. And it was a real concern to the expert who had a look at it for us. And what other alternatives has DOC looked at, and why is DOC going in the path that it's going in? Is there any legitimate reason to prefer one method over another? Is it just a fashion, a preference? Is it because the funding's allocated for one choice, even if it's not necessarily the best choice? Another question about the Wildlife Act. I've just been in a Court of Appeal case under the Wildlife Act. It's an offence to kill wildlife. And these drops do kill wildlife. They kill wekas, they kill probably native invertebrates and all sorts of different animals, and they often kill the very birds that you're definitely trying to protect. They sometimes kill them directly when they eat the baits, and they sometimes cause them a secondary kill when they eat another species that's eaten the poison bait. So there needs to be a Wildlife Act assessment to ascertain whether it's justified in terms of the Wildlife Act, because to kill the very wildlife that you're trying to save is a pretty high price to pay. Now, the other part of what I'm going to talk about, and I hope everyone's not too bored so far, is empowering communities. I've done a lot of these different issues for different communities, and I'm trying to put together a sort of a blueprint of things that work and to help communities, because what tends to happen is an issue arises and people go, gosh, this is terrible, but what do we do? And it's really hard. People start with a great amount of enthusiasm, but it's exhausting when you go down blind alleys and you feel like you're getting nowhere. So the challenge in all of this is it's pretty easy to see where something's happening that you don't like, and it's pretty easy these days to gather evidence on that, because others probably have suffered the same type of thing that they didn't want, and the internet's a great resource for finding information. But it's a real challenge getting a forum where someone will actually listen to you. And it shouldn't be a challenge, because we have public servants whose job it is to listen to communities and to help make good informed decisions, but something's gone wrong in our system. It's out of kilter at the moment, and we have systems that try to block the public from engagement rather than actually listen to the public. And it's hard work to get a forum. You basically have to make the biggest fuss that you can, and you have to find whatever friends and allies you can find, even if they're not exactly aligned, but if they've got similar views, so you can sort of feed off the energy of each other and work together with that, because it's too hard for one or two people to stop anything, and people get exhausted, and the system relies on people getting exhausted. That's how it works. People say, over my dead body. Well, sometimes it is over their dead body, because they just work themselves to death trying to stop something, and it shouldn't be like that. So you need to have a strategy as a community about who's got what skills and who can offer what, and what other communities in your island may have slightly different interests, but they might still like to think that consultation really means consultation. And even if they're not particularly worried about poison, they might be worried about that issue, or they might be worried about some other related issue. There'll be numerous other communities in New Zealand that are concerned about these type of issues. There's a really major problem going on at the moment where the police and DOC are using intimidation techniques to block peaceful protest. It's been happening all around the country. In the Brook Valley, the police trespassed off local residents from a public reserve to try and give priority access to the poisoners in their helicopters. It's illegal what the police did. I told the police it was illegal what they did before they did it. They did it anyway. They scared everybody away so that the helicopters could come and land and drop poison. During the actual drop, the police arrested more people. They charged one in court. They eventually withdrew all the charges. It was illegal what the police did. A complaint, no doubt, will get its way through the system when people sort of have enough energy to catch up on that. But what it did was it disempowered the community from taking a lawful action to protect their place against actions that hadn't been consulted on. Now, I don't condone anything illegal, but peaceful protest is protected by the law, is protected by the Magna Carta, the New Zealand Bill of Rights and everything else, and it's the lack of education of our police that's a problem in this case. So the type of thing you can do is actually talk to the police beforehand and make sure they understand that they are limited in their rights. They must not automatically side with the government departments, which is what they amazingly told us. We had a meeting with the police after the event. They told us that they always automatically side with the government department. And believe it or not, they couldn't even see anything wrong with that. I said, but your job is to uphold the law. And he kind of looked at me that I'd said this amazing thing that he'd never thought of before. It's so drummed into them that they have to side with the government departments. Now, it's not the only case in Nelson. There's been the case in the Coromandel where one of the protesters found D.O.C, and this is not personal against anybody in D.O.C, it's just a real concern for communities, that they found D.O.C storing poison in I believe it was a commercial area next to a supermarket. A couple of local residents found it being loaded late at night. They went to have a look. They were accosted by an unlicensed security guard who dragged a man out of his car, beat him up, as I understand it. When he defended himself, he managed to get away. The security camera was cut so that he was given the video, and the police were given the video of the part where he was defending himself, but not the first part of the video where he was dragged out of the car and beaten up. He eventually went to court and got the whole video and got off not guilty. But it should never have happened like that. How did it ever get to that stage? Other cases on the West Coast, same sort of thing that's happened. People are being trespassed off public roads so they can't get anywhere near a drop zone to get evidence. I said to the police, it's actually perverting the course of justice to stop the community getting close enough to get evidence about potential offending. And it is. It's a serious criminal charge when the police are blocking public access illegally to stop communities getting information. But we've sort of lost all this learning in New Zealand, and it's only when communities think about it and talk about it and raise awareness that we reassert our rights and get things back the way they should be. It's really, really important, because if we don't do that, we lose more and more and more of our rights, and the police get more and more carried away doing what they think is the right thing without ever even thinking about it. So yeah, for communities, I suggest develop a strategy, find others with a common interest. It doesn't have to be an exactly matching interest, but just enough in common. Build teams of people with different skills. The more difference, the better, because everyone brings something to the table, and you know, you get people with lifetime experience trapping, you get people that have been helicopter pilots, you get lawyers, you get doctors, you get vets, you get a whole range of people with different skills. Then you can actually build some really good outcomes of what you want. I'd allocate tasks between yourself. Make sure that nobody's trying to do everything. It's too hard. And who's going to do what? And expose the inconsistencies that you find, the false assumptions, the claims. Make the decision maker justify what they're doing. Don't just let them have a free path. They may be breaking the law. They may not have considered alternatives. They may actually genuinely believe what they're doing, but they just didn't actually think about something, and they don't know until you tell them. So make sure that the best decision is made by the community standing up for its rights. And there are plenty of win-win solutions here, you know. It's not like there's only one way. There's always other ways of doing things that are better. And it's by talking and sharing ideas that you find those ways. And you may well be the model for a whole new way for the rest of New Zealand. People will look to the Great Barrier Rakitu model as the way it can be done. Set a whole new benchmark. You guys have got all the skills and expertise and everything to do that. There are resources, there are people that will help from elsewhere in New Zealand if they know what's needed. But you've got to craft a solution that fits your situation and then explain it so clearly that everybody has to go with that. It's a mixture of enthusiasm and belief and just sharing, and all sorts of things come together and you can get a great solution. You have to make a big fuss. You can't just sit back and think it'll be all right. And you have to be aware that this may just be the start. First they poison Rakitu, then they need to poison other areas, because otherwise there might be a rat here that might swim over there, and you know we can't risk that. So it becomes a multiplier effect. If you get it on a good track from the start, everything else will follow on a good track. If you let this one go and think it'll be right later, you'll probably end up with an even bigger problem right next to your own homes, and it'll just multiply. So if the people stand up and say, no, this is not okay, we don't want this to happen, Doc, you act for us, our taxes go to you. You've got a duty to protect the public interest, not just what your current minister wants. Your duty is to us. Get the conversation going, and that's how you get some change. Oh, I've lost the bit there, but the bit there is say, make the biggest fuss you can. However you've got to do it, be creative, come up with something that people can't miss. And you've already done an amazing art exhibition, fantastic. But where's TV? Where are they? That should be on headline news. This is the people of Great Barrier having a voice. You know, think about how you can get more coverage and more awareness and make a bigger fuss so that more people know about it. Oh, that's it. Make the biggest impact. I knew it was there somewhere. And never ever doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Margaret Mayhew. And there's another cool one. If you think you're too small to make a difference, think about a mosquito in your bedroom at night. So I've talked about that. And the self-setting trap's a huge success. We're given a lot of propaganda about the Kiwis and that we've got to poison to save the Kiwis. Actually, the truth is that the most successful Kiwi breeding's in the Uraweras. They take out numerous eggs from there to allocate around New Zealand to try and rebuild the Kiwis' numbers. The place they put them is Mount Bruce down near Masterton. Mount Bruce has got a horrendous record. They poison, there's no predators. They use every poison under the sun. They kill nearly all the Kiwis they're given. When you look at, there's a lot of Official Information Act requests, and Clyde Graff and Kathy White and lots of people have done lots of work on this. The information that you're given is not true. Look it up for yourself, do your own research, and what you will see is there are plenty of great successes where there's no poisons. And there's plenty of disasters where there are poisons. And all of those costs are ignored. I've probably talked about most of them. The other cost is Clean Green New Zealand. Our tourists come to New Zealand, people pay premiums for our food because it's clean and green. We actually have to walk the walk and do that. We actually have to deliver. We can't keep putting poison into things and calling ourselves clean green. It's not true. And just talk briefly about the Poisons Register. I think I've already mentioned it, but it's horrendous, the amount of poisoning in New Zealand, unintended poisoning. The government doesn't have a register. They're supposed to notify all cases of suspected poisoning. Not a single one gets onto the register. The Reefton sisters who had 1080 dropped on them during a picnic, a draft report was done. They were told the final was coming. They've now been told, oh no, we don't think we'll do a final report. So it doesn't get on the register. The Brodifacoum cases in Nelson, so far 6 months has passed, the Medical Office of Health hasn't followed them up. Patararu, they somehow called it botulism. I mean, it didn't match the symptoms, it didn't match the timing, it didn't match the circumstances. The test results were all negative for botulism. something's going on at a high level in government that's stopping truthful information being collated in a scientific way so that we can make informed decisions. And it's a very serious something that's going wrong. We've given the government a register and asked them, invited them to take over managing it. They don't want it. We're going to keep trying. So that's the sort of summary. I hope I've covered what you wanted me to cover. And thank you all for coming. I'm really happy to answer any questions or try and answer them.